about one flat earther who flew to this convention from Argentina. And he believed in the disc version of the world. And when he was introduced, the organizer said there was a mix-up with his flight because he arrived 24 hours earlier than we were expecting. We thought he'd arrive on the Thursday, but he arrived on the Wednesday, and I had to rush to the airport and rescue him because we weren't expecting him. And everyone just laughed like this was a normal kind of mix-up. But I thought to myself, I wonder if this kind of thing happens all the time when your worldview can't account for the international dateline. Yeah. Does this kind of mix-up happen all the time? I have no idea.
Hi, I'm Rebecca, the skeptic half of the Seeker and The Skeptic. I'm really excited to share this conversation between my co-host Kat and my fellow skeptic Marsh with you. Marsh, or Michael Marshall, as he's known on Wikipedia, is one of the hosts of the Skeptics with a K podcast, which is one of the podcasts that first got me into skepticism. He's also one of the organizers of QED, a huge, impact, it might be the biggest in the world, skeptical conference. He works for the Good Thinking Society, a non-profit that promotes scientific skepticism, and he has another podcast called Be Reasonable, in which he talks to people with fringe beliefs. Which is why I thought a chat between him and my favorite woo might be fun. For our next interview, Kat will matchmake me with another seeker. I'm looking forward to it already. In our regular Seeker and the Skeptic podcast, Kat and I explore all sorts of fringe topics, from ufology to astrology. You can find those shows in your podcast app, on YouTube, or on our website, seekerandskeptic.com. We're on social media too, of course. Look for @SeekerSkeptic on Twitter and Instagram. We hope this conversation will inspire you to talk to someone on the other side of the Seeker-Skeptic divide.
Hi, Marsh. Welcome to The Seeker and the Skeptic.
Oh, thanks very much for having me on.
Yeah, this is good fun. We've been really enjoying having these conversations with people from differing backgrounds. And as I'm the seeker, I guess you're the skeptic here.
I am, and I definitely do appreciate the idea of talking to people with different backgrounds, with different beliefs. It's something that I do myself fairly often, or a bit less often than I'd like to at the moment. But yeah, I think it's really important to have conversations with people who aren't always on exactly the same page as you on lots of different topics, really. Completely.
And yeah, I'm going to ask a bit more about how you got into the work that you're doing within the world of skepticism. But I thought before you begin, I'd like to hear your definition of skepticism, just for people who, they might have heard me and Rebecca talk about it, but how would you define the word skeptic?
I think it's all about looking at the evidence behind often you'd say extraordinary claims, but it doesn't have to be extraordinary claims. It's just that when claims are particularly extraordinary, you have to look even more closely to see whether they stack up for the evidence. And so I run, I'm one of the co-runners of a Skeptics in the Pub organization. I MC our monthly events that we have. And the analogy that I always use on stage is, when you go and buy a second-hand car, the person selling you the car will say, this is the best car you'll ever have. You never need to think about another car. This is a wonderful car. But you don't just take their word for it. You lift up the bonnet and have a little poke around. You take it for a test drive. You kick the wheels. You try and figure out whether what they're saying actually holds up. And that's what skepticism is, really. Instead of just test driving cars, we test drive all ideas. And the ones that don't stand up to evidence, we try and sort of do something about them as much as anything else.
Fair enough. It's kind of like the opposite of what I'm prone to doing, which is like walking into some spiritual bookstore, or like going up to the bookshelf in a regular bookstore with all the weird esoteric stuff, and just kind of being like, oh, well, since they published a book, I guess it must be true. Not recommended by most skeptics.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the thing is, for me, I think looking into those books is really, really fun, and looking into these different ideas, and especially when it comes to like folkloric beliefs and stuff like that, I think there's still a huge amount of value in those beliefs, but we don't have to take those beliefs literally. And what I do as we'll come to some of the work I do on a daily basis, I tend to be looking at the places where people have taken these beliefs literally and unfortunately have been harmed along the way. And so anything we can do to reduce the harm that can be done to people by, as best as I can tell, looking for the best available evidence and the best available kind of critical thinking around an idea, you can reduce the potential damage it can do to people and sort of protect them from harm. And that's what I'm all about, really.
Right. And yeah, I'd like to know more about that. So what got you into, I guess, like activism within the skeptical world? You're part of lots of things. So the Good Thinking Society, you've got these podcasts. and there's a big skeptic conference. Am I right that you help out with, or you organise?
Yeah. So I co-founded the Merseyside Skeptic Society in 2009. And I think I'd sort of stumbled across skepticism through various kind of podcasts and things, maybe about a year before that, something like that. And when I first came across it with someone who at the time was a complete stranger, and we decided to set the group up together, and he's gone on to become a very good friend of mine, Mike Hall, really, really remarkable fella. We'd had sort of similar experiences where we'd been the person in the conversation who was like, well, this isn't true. And our friends wouldn't be the ones who were saying, well, actually, astrology is absolutely real. They'd be saying, well, it doesn't really matter if it's true or not. And we'd find ourselves being the only ones in those conversations saying, well, it sort of does matter, because if people are basing their entire lives on it, it's worth finding out if it's true or not. And that's kind of why we started the Skeptics in the pub. But from day one, we had quite an activist mentality, because I've always been a big believer. Well, first of all, it was finding out that this stuff was out there also meant that you were allowed to go and investigate it, to go and explore it, to go and hear someone telling you their ideas, and go and see what it's like firsthand when people are promoting, an alternative medical practice. You're not just limited to seeing that online. You can go to a mind, body, spirit festival, or you can go to an open day at a health clinic type thing, and hear firsthand how people who really believe this stuff is true, how they talk about it, what they say to people, what they say they can cure, for example. And when you see that in person, I think it makes you way more informed about these ideas in the first place than you ever would be if you just looked online at what people are saying. But it also makes you have a much better understanding about how people come to believe in these ideas. And so you have a much more rounded and, dare I say, more compassionate approach, because the people who believe in ideas that you disagree with aren't abstract creatures who exist on the other side of a Twitter exchange, but they're actually real human beings that you've sat next to in a room, and you've heard firsthand the problems they might be facing, or you might have had a conversation with them. And so we've always had this kind of go out there and explore kind of idea. And it was through that I started coming across things that were particularly harmful. I've sat in a room where somebody's got up on stage and he's directly said to people in the audience, what chemotherapy are you taking? Okay, you need to stop taking that, because my alternative cancer cure won't work if you're taking chemotherapy. So that named drug you just gave me, stop taking that immediately, and instead come to my clinic in New Mexico and pay me £30,000 for a fortnight's treatment, and I promise you I will cure your cancer. And when you see that, you see the real harm of it. That's kind of what got me interested in saying, well, if these ideas aren't true, what can we do to spread information about these ideas, and how to check whether these ideas are true or not, to prevent the next person who goes in there not knowing these are the facts about it, hearing only a one side of the kind of debate, one side of the conversation, and missing some of these crucial questions that, once you know the questions to ask, you can get to the nub of whether it works or not. And maybe if we do that enough and you can talk to enough people, you stop that person who, or at least it's not necessarily stop that person, but you give that person with cancer information about what to expect before they go in. And maybe they make a decision differently because they've been given access to all of the facts, rather than just the facts that this guy on stage wanted to sell them.
Yeah, no, that's a really great explanation. And it's also very, I guess, heartwarming for me to hear this, because it's similar to speaking to Rebecca about this stuff, as well as the previous guest on the show, Anthony Magnabosco. Just seeing people who are coming from the skeptical perspective, but not just because they're like, I think a lot of people have this idea of the skeptic being like the cranky old man at the back of the pub who just wants to tell everyone that their beliefs are crap and like go to hell, just to be right. And I guess there are like some maybe trolls on the internet in that mindset, but you guys have opened my mind up to seeing how, no, you're clearly motivated by care of other people. First of all,
I think so.
Yeah, like first of all, like wanting to make sure that people don't risk their lives because of some dream in this weird New Mexican like cult, or that they don't, that you don't give them an unfair deal. So you actually, like you said, you go out and explore and speak to these people directly.
Yeah, I think it's really important. And I sort of describe a lot of journeys into skepticism as being, you go through something of a sort of skeptical adolescence, I would sort of call it, which is, and I was exactly the same as that, where you find out that these ideas exist, that skepticism is a thing, that it's a movement, that there are people like you out there. And you spend a large part of your life being the only one who actually cares about these things. and you want to learn as much as possible, and you want to tell everybody. And so you become the person who's like, well, that doesn't work. Homeopathy's nonsense. And did you know this? And what do they call alternative medicine that works? They call it medicine. And you repeat these very easy tropes because they feel good to have found this community. But I think if you're involved in skepticism for a while and you really do care about trying to protect people from these ideas, which I think is the whole point of skepticism, really. It's not just about being right or getting as close to right as possible. That's only the first step, is to try and make sure that your opinions are as correct as possible by following the evidence. That's step one. And in many ways, it's the easy bit, because the only thing you need to change is what you think. The rest of the steps as to how you take that information and actually use it to make a difference, to protect someone from this, to make this person who might be doing a lot of very harmful things, make it much harder for them to do those harmful things to people. That's the difficult stuff, but it's the stuff that actually matters, is sort of changing the world around us. And I think when you come into skepticism and you're around it for long enough, and you really do have that care and protection and social contract kind of idea at the center of why you're involved, you realize that skeptical adolescence is not the best way to achieve any of those goals. And I think you do then progress into a much more compassionate, collaborative, understanding form of skepticism, where we're not just saying, I'm right, you're wrong, you're an idiot, which is the worst thing you could possibly say, not least because it's not true, that this person isn't an idiot just because they disagree with you. But it's also not helpful and not going to achieve anything. You try and find ways of actually connecting with people, engaging with people, and forming the kind of bonds that you need in order to have people actually listen to you and take what you're saying seriously.
Yeah, and I guess this is probably something that you've seen a lot, but like, let's say beginner skeptics, or maybe even more advanced skeptics, if that's a thing, just not knowing how to communicate with what I'm going to call the seekers. Yeah, and I was just kind of curious as to what are some of the mistakes that you've seen happening within the skeptic community when people are trying to like debunk things and speak directly to people who believe in something that may not be founded on truth.
Yeah, I mean, I think by and large, the vast majority of skeptics that I meet are absolutely well-meaning. They really want to be doing well. They aren't. So I don't want to sit here and say, here's this big list of things, how everyone's doing skepticism wrong and I'm doing skepticism right. But I can talk about experiences that I've had in my journey into being a more kind of, rounded or more compassionate, or trying to be a better skeptic. I think the first things you come across in skepticism is the idea that first of all, you come across the evidence. And you think, well, if only I give everybody the evidence, they'll also make decisions about this that I would agree with, that I think would flow from the evidence. And that feels an intuitive thing to say, but actually, practically, it doesn't work that way, because I genuinely think it turns out we don't make our decisions based on evidence. Even those of us who, in the skeptical community, we'd like to say that we're all about, we are, by definition, what we're trying to do is follow the evidence. I think in lots of occasions, what we're actually doing is we're in the instances that disagree with us, we're looking hard at the evidence. And the instances that agree with us, we look a little bit less hard at the evidence. We might be training our instincts to be more evidence-based, but in many ways, we're still making our decisions based on our instincts, except where we pause and go, hang on a second, I believe in this, and I think this is true, so I should really look at this even more rather than just accept it. Because we as human beings don't question the things we agree with anywhere near the amount of scrutiny that we question the things we disagree with. So I think we don't make decisions based on evidence. And when you're talking to people who fundamentally believe in something that you don't think is a good fit with the best available evidence, you can't persuade them very easily to question those beliefs by just giving them the evidence. So I've done tests with people who believe themselves to be psychic, and tested them under scientific conditions. And at the end, when you've talked them through you've collaborated with them on a very fair protocol that they agree is a very, very fair way to check whether what they're doing is true. And they say, absolutely, there's no problem at all with me doing this. This is very easy for me to do the way that my psychic abilities work. I read auras, or I can seek the dead. And so there are ways for me to get around whatever controls you put in place by using my sixth sense, or my paranormal ability, rather than my 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 senses that anybody who wouldn't have a sixth sense would fail under these conditions. When you talk them through that, and then they do that test, and then the results of that test show that under this test they didn't show themselves to be psychic, They don't say, well, the evidence says I'm not psychic. They say, let me have another look at that test because it can't have been right. And actually on that third one, I didn't want to say anything because I didn't want to be disruptive, but I didn't feel quite right. And sometimes the spirits like to play games with me. So maybe they were and you find lots of different reasons. And the reason why they're looking to do that isn't because they're dishonest. It's because being a psychic for those people that I've tested is a core part of their identity. You know, if I asked you name something about yourself, you might come up with a few different things. You know, I might say I'm a skeptic. I might say I'm really into football. I might say that I love music. But for these ladies, the first thing they would say about themselves is, I'm psychic. And to turn over something that is so fundamental and core to the very idea of who they are, you can't do that by just saying, here's what the evidence says. You have to first engage with that person at a human level, understand that identity position and their values and that kind of area, and approach it with the kind of, I don't want to say kid gloves, but certainly with a gentleness that challenging or questioning or calling into question in some ways someone's very identity requires. You can't just say you're wrong and I can prove it, because they're just not going to listen to that. They're going to shut down.
Yeah.
So I think that's something that we skeptics can get wrong by just assuming that the evidence is everything. And my favorite thing about that is I still meet people who say, well, look, if you show somebody the evidence and they don't change their mind, there is nothing you can do for them. And I say, well, have you looked at the evidence around how you change people's minds? Because if you look at all that evidence, it says giving people the evidence doesn't work. And now that I've told you that, if you carry on thinking giving people the evidence does work, you're just proving me right. That I've given you all the evidence and you still hold the position you previously had because it wasn't about the evidence for you. It was about something else. And then you start looking at what that something else is, and whether it's kind of an in-group superiority, whether it's a need to belong, whether it's kind of how you see yourself. You need to see yourself as a rational actor, and therefore you'll project this rationalism on the human condition, which I don't think is necessarily there. You know, there's lots of other reasons for it. But yeah, we have to understand the people before we start explaining to people why ideas don't stand up to scrutiny.
Yeah, it's been that's a really good example. So with that previous interview with Anthony, we spent a lot of time talking about beliefs being attached to community. So when you get into a community attached to this belief system, it becomes very hard to leave that belief system. And you've just reminded me of the other big one, which is identity. And you know, as you said, you know, if you were to talk about yourself, you would say things like, I'm into sports, music. It would be interesting if instead of saying that I'm a psychic or I'm an astrologer, we say things like, I'm Kat, but I love astrology and I'm into psychic stuff as well. I wonder if it would help us, our identities, if we stopped identifying so much with our beliefs. And even like it goes both ways, right? So for Rebecca, maybe she isn't a skeptic. She thinks skeptically. I'm not a seeker. I enjoy seeking.
Yeah,
I wonder if that helps.
I think so. And to be honest, if people were to ask me, when I say that I'm a skeptic, when people ask me, even then what I mean, I think maybe differs from what other people might mean when they say they're a skeptic. Because when I say I'm a skeptic, what I try and mean is I try my best to think skeptically about as many things as possible. And I am definitely going to fail at that. But because I'm trying, I'm going to fail less often than if I wasn't trying. And I think that's very different from people who might say the essential version of I'm a skeptic, now give me something to be right about. You know, it's like, I'm already a skeptic, now just point me in a direction, I'll tell you the right thing. And I think when people have that approach to skepticism, or that version of skepticism, even if they're not really cognizant that they've got that version, it might work very well when they're looking at well-trodden skeptical paths. And you can say, I'm a skeptic, and so I can show you why homeopathy doesn't work. You know, or I'm a skeptic and I can talk to you about how chiropractic was invented and how the guy who first came up with it thought he could cure deafness by manipulating the spine. And it's very easy to be skeptical about those things. But if your version of being a skeptic is, I am right because I follow the evidence, when you come across something that doesn't fit in that same kind of way, or when you have an ideological bias towards it, you know, you might see people in a certain way. You might think that there are innate differences between men and women, and that fundamentally alters the way that the genders work and how we interact with one another. And if you believe yourself to always be Mr. Skeptic all the time, you don't apply that self-criticism to your existing ideology, and you may come up with a completely wrong answer for that reason. So I think it is that idea of when you're holding one of these identity positions, never hold it so strongly that it can't be shaken in any kind of way. And one of the ways to do that, I think, is to say, I'm Marsh, and what I try and do is think skeptically, rather than I am a skeptic and that is everything about me, and heaven help you if you try and alter that, because I will defend with my life.
Right. And at that point it becomes, well, it's another belief system, really. And like, I guess in ways it is, but taken to the extreme, I mean, maybe that's a question, like, taken to the extreme, can skepticism be bad for you? Like, can that be dangerous?
I think it depends on what we mean by skepticism, because I think it would be fair to say that skepticism is another belief system, but that belief would be the idea that the best access we have to truth around us, we can't get a perfect access to truth, but the best approximation we can get to truth is by following evidence and reliable, replicable tests and logic. That those are the best tools we have in order to access the fuzziest version of truth that's out there, because we'll never have a direct connection to truth. And in that sense, I think it's a belief system, but it's also a belief system that does come with quite a lot of backed up evidence to say that this is not a bad way of looking at things. But can skepticism be bad? Well, it can be bad if the version of skepticism you're ascribing to is the I'm right and I'm very good at figuring stuff out because I'm right about this laundry list of things. If the version you have is I'm holding ideas provisional until I find evidence in the contrary, but until I find evidence of something extraordinary, I'm not going to believe the extraordinary answer. I'm going to believe the more mundane answer until I can rule that out. Because with the old example being, when you hear hoofbeats, more often than not, it's going to be horses, not zebras. So you shouldn't go around expecting to see a zebra every time you hear a hoofbeat, because you're going to be wrong more often than you're right. I think that form is unlikely to go wrong. Where we see it spilling into things is we see things like conspiracy theory in a way can be I don't want to say the paranoia of skepticism, but certainly the questioning everything of skepticism. It's that out of control without being tempered by self-criticism. So it's questioning the external world without any degree of questioning the internal world of I think I can figure all of that out without ever countenancing the idea that I could be wrong. And I think that's the form of a contorted form of skepticism that does lead to quite damaging thinking.
Yeah, that's so interesting. It's almost like this circle that comes around on itself. If you have the Seeker and the Skeptic polls, then you kind of get conspiracy theories. Some maybe very valid, and who knows which ones are right. I don't know.
Yeah.
But it's the idea that if you go too far in either of those directions, you end up.
Well, I think so, but I think it's more that there are the skepticism. Yeah, if you split it into internal and external, I think that's maybe the other way that I look at it is the external skepticism, these ideas that I'm coming across, I'm going to look at the evidence, I'm going to scrutinize all that to see if I can figure out what I think is true. But then you also have to apply internal skepticism, which is, could I be wrong about things? And I think what I see most often in conspiracy theory, and even to a degree in other kind of paranormal beliefs or alternative beliefs or beliefs that would sort of be in the category you might consider seeker, is I like this idea, I've seen this idea, this looks true to me, so how do I prove it true? Rather than how do I prove it false? And the way we have at best accessing what we could say is an approximation of truth is this idea seems to work, how do I break it? And if I try everything I can to prove it wrong and I can't prove it wrong, maybe I should accept that it could be right until I think of another way to prove it wrong. And so we see this with when I talk to people who believe that they have intuition, that they can manipulate the world to some degree through, whether that's through tarot cards, whether it's through an innate psychic ability to influence traffic lights to turn green. What people look for is confirmatory evidence. I can do it, and look, I'm going to show you that I can do it. I've tried, it worked there. but they won't say, well, they won't try and say, well, what happens if I try something else? Do I get the same result? What if I try to do the opposite? Do I get the same result? They won't look for all of the times that it doesn't work, because those don't fit the paradigm that they're trying to build. Whereas the scientific or the skeptical point of view is, I think this is true. I now need to work as hard as I can to prove it false. And if I work my ass off and get nowhere, then maybe I can accept it's true for now. And I think that's the best way we keep ourselves honest, for want of a better word.
Yeah, for sure. I think you said it earlier, this idea of having provisional beliefs. I think that's a really good way to be. It's like, I'm open to changing my mind either way, if this thing turns out, if I get more evidence in another direction. It also made me think about people who maybe they do start to investigate. Like, I know one astrologer who started out his astrology career by trying to disprove astrology, and accidentally finding something in astrology that was very useful and enough to become an astrologer. But that did start out at least with skeptical intentions. So, and similarly, I've been finding with a lot of my, out there beliefs are that even for me, these are provisional for me as well. So I think there are seekers who also have provisional beliefs. Like at the moment, tarot seems to be working, or whatever it is, these things that they seem to be getting evidence for in their minds, in our minds. And then finding myself at least getting to a place where I'm like, yeah, I'm not sure. Somebody could give me enough evidence that this is just not true. This really is all my mind and a lot of other people's minds. But would that make a difference in the benefits that I'm getting from it, from all these different perspectives, including things like community, identity, and maybe like just the fun of a lot of these practices? That so many of them are just so fun. So
yeah.
So I'm wondering like what you think about that. And I've asked this to Rebecca before. I'm like, and that's how a lot of our episodes have ended. It's like we investigate something and I'm like, well, what's really the harm of believing this, even if it is like horse swaddle? It's like,
Yeah. Well, funnily enough, I mean, so you can see if you're looking at the video that I have a poster on my wall here of the Flat Earth. I
yes.
went to the Flat Earth convention in Birmingham in 2018, one of the most fun weekends I've ever spent. And what I find really fascinating about the Flat Earth movement is so many people who believe in the Flat Earth got into it because they first saw these ideas come up and thought, I can prove these ideas wrong. And then because they couldn't prove these ideas wrong, they accepted that, well, there's no other explanation. It must be that the world is flat. Now, the third option there is that the world isn't flat. There is a way to prove it is round, but you haven't managed to do that, but someone else out there can. Right. And I think occasionally people will elevate their own powers of deduction, observation, of gathering evidence above consensus. And so they will say, well, I tried everything and I really looked, but if your motivations or your expertise or your experience doesn't allow you to access the right kind of question, then it's incumbent on you to try and find what those questions are, even if it means accepting someone else's set of questions and checking those. And that's where we kind of missed with the Flat Earth. But at the Flat Earth Convention, there was a speaker there who pointed out why this model of the Flat Earth with the circular disc around the edge and the Arctic Circle in the middle and everything sort of flat from there, how this can't possibly be true. Because, for example, people in Australia and people in South America see the same constellations that you can't see when you're in Europe. And that makes no sense if you're on a flat plane looking at the same set of stars. So even that alone, and there's lots of other proofs, but that alone should prove this entire idea wrong. And so he'd gone away and started to come up with his own version of that idea. And the next speaker at the convention would get up and would say this round model was exactly true again. And nobody in the audience would seem to mind that they've just had this comprehensively disproven. Because for so many other people there, it was about the community. It was about the value set for lots of people. It's that a lot of people say they went through a very rough time in their life and then they realized the world was flat and they found this community of people who would talk to them about lots of different things. And so for them, I think picking at the edges of that belief, I don't think they're interested in that because they've invested in the community so much. And so they don't care what shape the world is. They only care what shape the world isn't. They don't care what flavor of right they are, as long as they agree that everyone else is wrong. And from that degree, you could say, well, this is not a harmful belief, that this provides them this sense of community, and it's definitely fun. There were some really fun ideas explored there. But the flip side of it is people who are at the convention some of the speakers were also talking about how they can cure cancer by injecting you with your own urine. There were people there who routinely would say, well, fluoride is evil, and GMOs are evil, and vaccines are really dangerous. And there were babies there. And I thought, I wonder if those parents have vaccinated those babies. I wonder if that baby took ill tomorrow, would those parents go and see a doctor and therefore go in for some of that big pharma medicine they've been saying they shouldn't do? Or would they go and see an alternative healer? And so what's the future of that baby there? One of the speakers got up and talked about how we know that the world is flat because NASA is a tool of Satan, and satanic symbols and signs are everywhere. And in fact, all of the tragedies and all the evil events that happen in the world are part of a preordained plan run by a secret cabal of Jewish people. And he specifically cited the book, The Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, as evidence of this, a well-known anti-Semitic hoax. And so on the one hand, we've got this fun community sharing these fun, silly ideas that on the face of it seem harmless. The idea of the flat earth is a pretty harmless idea. But on the other hand, we're seeing anti-vax stuff there. We're seeing cancer cure stuff there. We're seeing anti-Semitism in there. And that was just the stuff that came out in conversation. So I think when you say to people, it's okay to believe these ideas, which are very, especially in the case of flat earth, a long way away from what the evidence says, a long way from what logic and reason and a rational worldview for whatever way we define that. I think one of the ways we wouldn't define it is believing the world was flat. If we say, well, it's okay to believe that because it's harmless, I think you sort of essentially intellectually ghettoize people. And once they're separated from rationale in one area, you leave them prey to these other ideas that can spread because they haven't got the inoculations of critical thinking, because they've had to suspend that critical faculty to believe in something that's a core part of their identity at that point.
Yeah, that is really interesting. And I can't deny that effect, at least in what I've seen and witnessed in myself. So especially, I guess, in terms of researching material for this podcast, we do wind up in these kind of rabbit holes, and then you see everything connecting, like people who are into witchcraft or whatever it is, they're also into this thing and this thing and this thing. And especially with the community that you get alongside of these, and if you're following somebody on Twitter who happens to have these multiple beliefs, it's hard not to kind of come along for the ride. And I can see how some of them, if you asked me a few years ago, like for example with astrology, if you'd asked me a few years ago, I'd be like, I would never believe in that. And then something happens, and then you get into other things as well because they go hand in hand. So yeah, it's definitely a slippery slope. It's good for me anyway. I know that it's good for me to have like at least one part of my mind, or at least have these regular conversations with Rebecca about these things. I'm pretty sure if I got sick, she wouldn't let me, ditch Western medicine. Yeah. So it's good to have, I guess what I'm trying to say is whatever you believe, it's nice to have a mixture of friends around you who aren't just all drinking the same Kool-Aid, basically.
Yeah, I think that's true. But I think one of the things that people get from exploring these alternative beliefs is the idea that it's fun, that it's exciting, that there's these unusual kind of experiences that come off the back of it, and that you can find yourself in sort of like in different communities than you'd otherwise be in. And I think you can still have all of those things and not have to believe in them. So I spend a lot of time, all right, less than I used to because I've got quite busy lately, but one of my favorite things to do was to go along to a psychic show, or go along to a Mind Body Spirit Festival, or spend 3 days at the Flat Earth Convention. And you get all of that same excitement and exploration of ideas without needing to believe that it's true. And it kind of reminds me of something that an Australian anthropologist said of when she was talking to Indigenous peoples about how they believed in the spirits of various different natural beings around them. And what she was saying was essentially that the more she talked to them, she was saying, well, it's true, but it's not literally true. Like, yes, the tree has a spirit, but it's not literally a spirit. It's not literally that you can talk to the tree, but also it is true because part of the way in which you see the world, the stories we tell each other about the world, these are just, in some ways, just as real about how our lives are constructed. They're just not literally true. It's kind of the example, I guess, of Santa Claus. As a social phenomena, Santa Claus is real. You can go to shopping centers and see Santa Claus. There's pictures of Santa Claus everywhere throughout December. Santa Claus is a real thing. but he doesn't literally exist. It's just that culturally and society and socially, we agree that this is a conversation we have, an idea that we can share. But if somebody was to say, I am waiting, that I absolutely believe Santa Claus is coming, and I literally believe he definitely is coming, I'm going to leave my doors wide open for Santa Claus to come, you wouldn't say, oh, that's absolutely fine, this person's completely fine. So we can have conversations about how, if Santa's coming tomorrow, oh yeah, what's Santa going to get you? But also if someone genuinely did 100% believe it, you would think that was a sign of something not quite going well with their lives.
Right.
So I think you can have truth in a social kind of way, in a kind of cultural way, of the conversations that we have and the stories we tell each other. And those have a value. It's just not a fact value. Or you can have sort of literal truth. And it's once we make decisions, the decisions we make that drive our lives are the ones that we're probably best anchoring a little bit more towards the actual literal truth. Whereas, the more mundane way that we fill our time and tell each other stories and sort of perceive the world and comfort ourselves, I think those are the ways in which we can go to folklore and myth and story and these other kind of cultural phenomena, because they exist to fill that space, but we just shouldn't make massive decisions about our lives, our health, our well-being based on them, I think.
Yeah, it's like we all have to we're acting all the time, and some of those actions are going to be based on like an absolute truth, and some are going to be based on this other kind of truth. And I guess part of skepticism is trying to make sure that some of those critical actions that you take, like in terms of your health, are based on the things that are closest to that absolute truth as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. I've met people in skepticism who'll say, well, I'm an atheist, and so when it comes to Christmas and people say to me, Merry Christmas, I'll always say, Happy Holidays, because I don't believe Christ existed. It's not, well, you don't need to believe Christ existed.
Go that far. Yeah.
If you take it that far, then why would you say Monday? Well, sorry, why would you say Thursday if you didn't believe Thor existed? Why would you say Friday if you didn't believe that Freitag existed? We have these cultural hangovers that are perfectly, or cultural hangover is probably a useful word. Hangovers of ideas we would otherwise have believed in. You don't have to abandon all of that culture and society because you don't believe in the literal truth of it. But when it comes to how we teach our children, I don't think we should be teaching children that Christ genuinely died and was resurrected, and therefore people can be resurrected, and that the world was built in 7 days by an omniscient being, or any of this kind of stuff, because that doesn't get us any closer to accessing real truth with a capital T. It sort of teaches us to believe in a magical worldview with magical versions of cause and effect that can have damaging effects. But believing that Christmas is nice without having to omit the word Christ, I think is kind of unnecessary.
Yeah, it's like my fear with a lot of this, I guess even with the podcast, and what I was pleasantly surprised with was Rebecca, for example, isn't interested in just like stripping the magic out of everyone's lives. Like that's not the aim for most skeptics anyway. And I think there is this kind of common sense attitude, especially with things like you said, Christmas. That's a great example. And I do kind of want to take clips of you saying that Santa is real, just clip out those bits. And that's why I was laughing. I was just like, I'm just imagining. That'd be a great clip for the show. Anyway, so one thing that I was wondering about was like, before you said you found these like podcasts and stuff on the internet about skepticism. Before that, was there anything that you believed in that you don't believe in now, other than Santa? What was your kind of background in skepticism or in Seekerism?
Yeah, so I don't have a conversion story particularly. I don't remember ever believing in Santa as a kid.
Oh, wow.
But I went to a Catholic school, and I don't remember ever believing in God. But I always viewed the two in a very similar way, that I was shocked when I got to the age of sort of 12, 13 and found that people genuinely thought there was an omniscient being who controlled all our actions and who cared if you slept with someone before marriage or any of these types of things. I was genuinely shocked that people did believe that, because I assumed that we were just doing that cultural thing with God that we do with Santa. In that, we all know he doesn't really exist, but we just say he exists because society gets lubricated a little bit better in some ways, and we get presents and various things like that. So I didn't really have any, I'd say, alternative beliefs. I maybe, as a kid, believed in ghosts before I really thought about ghosts, but never so strongly that by the time I was kind of looking at evidence, I already had a belief in ghosts. I think uh, I probably at one point was unconvinced about the evidence of climate change, probably my kind of mid-teens, until I looked a bit more at the evidence and kind of changed my mind on that. But I don't really have, lots of skeptics that I meet have these big kind of Damascene conversion moments in their lives where they might have gone through a fundamentalist religious upbringing, and then have come to realize that they don't believe in a god, or that they were brought up in a household that used nothing but alternative medicine and then started examining that. I don't have that. And I think for those people, that's what draws them to skepticism, that they've seen some of the harms, either physical or emotional or intellectual, or kind of through their own kind of comfort, that they've seen themselves harmed in various ways by these ideas. And I think some people do go into that skeptical adolescence or atheistic kind of the stereotypical angry atheist kind of persona, because they've seen in their own lives the harm that these ideas can do, and they're sort of recovering from that harm or that trauma in some cases. I don't have that. And so the reason I got involved in skepticism was much more about people, is I'm just absolutely fascinated by the idea that people will believe something that the rest of society will look at and go, that doesn't make sense. And so that's what really drives me. What's always really fascinated me is people's beliefs, and how our personalities and the cultural influences on us can nudge us in certain directions that we come to believe in these kind of ideas, and then how you can nudge people back out of them. So I'm afraid I don't really have any big exciting stories of like, well, I used to, I was raised on homeopathy to the age of 12, and nothing like that, I'm afraid.
No, that's good. In fact, it's really good for me to hear a story of the other side, which is having that interest in people, because I'm more on that side. I don't think as a kid, okay, maybe not, I did believe in Santa until I was 10, and slowly reasoned my way out of it. But I was wondering about that idea that there are certain people who are maybe more inclined towards looking into these things, because it sounds like what a lot of you're doing is you get to indulge that curiosity side of your personality. It's it sounds very curious and creative to look at these bonkers beliefs and really investigate them and actually spend time on that, but without, like you said, kind of actually believing in it. You get to have the fun of investigating it. So that would suggest certain things about your personality. Same with other people. It's more like what about their personality was so invested in something but somehow changed. Anyway, what are your thoughts on that, personality and skepticism?
Oh gosh, I'm not sure, because I think skepticism, it attracts all sorts of different personalities. I think it will attract people who see themselves as very logical thinkers, and people who are driven in that kind of way. But I think it's more and more starting to attract people who see the people behind the ideas. And I think it is that thing that you can get all of the benefits out of believing in Bigfoot, for example, or believing in the Loch Ness Monster, by studying stories about Bigfoot and Loch Ness Monster, and also trying to figure out what people actually saw, without actually having to genuinely believe that every one of them is Bigfoot. And in many ways, I think you get a bit more out of it because you don't stop so quickly. If someone says, I saw a UFO and it looked like this, if you believe in UFOs automatically, then you go, oh, okay. And that's kind of the end for you. Whereas if you don't, you start thinking, well, what could that have been? And how could this have looked differently? And and so it's those stories that I think are just really intriguing. There's a skeptical investigator called John Nichol, who spent decades and decades looking to every one of the big mysteries. Right? He figured out how the Turin Shroud was made using 15th century technology, and had a chemist he worked with recreate it exactly to demonstrate that it could be done. But he always talks, I've heard him talk about the Mothman. The idea that people were seeing these big eyes flying at a certain height and a big sort of wingspan, and it was all this kind of stuff. And they thought it was like an alien, or was it a cryptid or something like that? And Joe said he looked at all the stories of it and thought, oh, that's this particular type of owl. And then he went there and hung around in that area and investigated. He said, I was completely wrong. It was a completely different type of owl. But actually going along and understanding the signs of being there, if you just accept that it's a Mothman, then you go around looking for the thing you think it is.
Right.
But you never really sort of pay attention to the evidence around you. Whereas if you go in saying, this story's fascinating, I want to learn more about it. There's a friend of mine, Haley Stevens, who's a ghost researcher. And she grew up believing in ghosts. She spent a long time going along to haunted places with all the technology. And she got experiences out of that. But then she came to realize that she didn't believe that these things were actually ghosts after all. And she spent a long time now looking into the same kind of ghost stories and being a ghost researcher, but someone who doesn't take the initial assumption that ghosts are real. And so you start looking at what else could be going on here. And there's a fantastic story she tells about a ghost picture that was in the Daily Mail, about a ghost that was on a pier, and the pier, it was at 4 o'clock in the morning, 5 o'clock in the morning, and the pier was locked at that time and no one could have got there, and it appeared and then it vanished. And people, if you believe in ghosts, you say, well, isn't that weird? But that's kind of the end for you. Whereas she looked into the pier and understood kind of, and research went on to the local fishermen's forum to understand fisher groups, and found out that the local fisher groups got access to that pier early in the morning. So then she looked closely at the picture to figure out what kind of jacket it was, and asked the local forum of fishermen, does anybody there have this particular jacket? We shared a picture, and she found the guy who was the ghost. And she went along and she met him and said, this is the ghost that was in the Daily Mail. Here I am with it. And I think that's an even more exciting story, that you not only have you investigated the ghost, but you found him, you've got his name and his address, and you've met him.
I love that. I'd never really thought of or heard a story that could help me see that there is so much magic in that sense, at least in like entertainment. Maybe that's the better word. At least entertainment in being a skeptic, or being more kind of critical minded about these things. It's not all, the fun isn't all reserved for people who believe in these things, basically.
Yeah, and so I think there's a lot of fun in it. I've had a huge amount of fun, just even the flat Earth investigation, on and off, talking to flat Earthers and going on flat Earth meetings. I've had a huge amount of fun there, and not fun, to be clear, it's not fun at their expense. When I tell stories of this, when I do talk about the flat Earth movement, I try as best as possible to never be saying, isn't this belief silly? Or at most I'm saying, isn't the belief silly, but not the person behind it? Or the thing I'm trying to say is actually what this looks like, and the experiences you have along the way. And I think that's where I find it fun. I talk about one flat earther who flew to this convention from Argentina, and he believed in the disc version of the world. And when he was introduced, the organizer said there was a mix-up with his flight, because he arrived 24 hours earlier than we were expecting. We thought he'd arrive on the Thursday, but he arrived on the Wednesday, and I had to rush to the airport and rescue him because we weren't expecting him. And everyone just laughed like this was a normal kind of mix-up. But I thought to myself, I wonder if this kind of thing happens all the time when your worldview can't account for the international dateline. Does this kind of mix-up happen all the time? I have no idea.
Yeah, wow. That's. I have so many questions about the stuff, but it sounds like you'd actually be the person to ask now.
But I think that's where the fun of exploration, investigation comes in. And then the other side of it is it's not necessarily the magic, but I think you get a lot of understanding of people out of really looking into these kind of stories. And there's a story I always like to tell about a folklorist by the name of Deborah Hyde, who's the editor of the Skeptic magazine. She does lots of talks, really fascinating talks on mythology from all around the world. And she gave a talk once about changeling mythology. So I don't know if you know much about changelings and kind of the idea of changelings.
Like, is it something to do with kids being swapped, or?
Yeah, absolutely. So the idea is, when a fairy gets too old and it's very hard to look after, the fairies will take your baby and swap it with their elderly fairy, disguise it to look like your baby. And so you end up bringing that fairy up and bringing it through its kind of days. And meanwhile, your baby is going off to live with the fairies and become one of the fairies. And that's kind of the mythology. And the idea is to get your baby back, you put your baby on a shovel and hold that shovel in the fire. And the changeling will go up the chimney and your baby will be back in the cot. But if you look at the stories around what people are actually experiencing when they think their baby has been turned into a changeling, their baby isn't progressing like all the other babies. The baby isn't able to make eye contact and isn't able to socialize and isn't responding to social cues. And I think a lot of those things are describing autism. Back in a time when we didn't have a description of autism, we didn't have an understanding of autism. And so I think what we see there is this thing we can't really understand that's happened. We can't really explain it, but we can now put an overlay on the world around us that starts to explain it. That gives you agency in the face of unsurety, of uncertainty, of even something quite upsetting if you don't understand what's happening. And I think that may be what's going on with that changeling mythology. And I think what's interesting there is that's not that different to what we saw in the 1990s and even now with the idea of people believing vaccines cause autism, because we still don't have a good understanding of the developmental factors involved in autism, whether there's a genetic component, whether an environmental component. We don't fully understand what makes people develop in that way and become autistic, or whether they were autistic from birth and they express in that way. We don't have a good understanding of that. And because we don't have a good understanding, it means that it's a very fertile ground for people to insert their own narratives. And that can lead into all sorts of fears that can then be incredibly harmful. And I don't know how many babies were burned on shovels in the centuries ago when changelings changeling mythology came to prominence. But we do have good numbers for how many babies weren't vaccinated as a result of the fears around autism, and therefore how many people are now suffering from vaccine-preventable diseases. But I think it's the same, in some ways, it's the same fears just being played out through a different narrative. So by looking at these things, we understand the human condition a little bit more, which is a good as reason as any to explore them.
Yeah, completely. Yeah, and in that way, developing that kind of compassion for people who believe something that you don't, when you realize, okay, we all share that same fear of a lack of certainty. You know, humans seem to want that, and the result of not knowing something being, I'm going to take action. And in some cases it might be, I'm going to make this little harmless ritual, then there's like a harmful ritual, and then there's, you know, whatever we're doing today. Final question before I let you go. Is there anyone that you've spoken to on your show, or just like in your years as a skeptic, that has changed your mind about something? Like, has a seeker, for example, ever convinced you of something?
So in terms of specific ideas, I don't think so. But normally it's because the people that I seek out are at the far end of some fairly far out ideas. So I've had people on my show be reasonable who believe that we don't need food or water to live, or that in 15th century Cornwall, two children appeared out of a cave who had completely green skin, and that's because they were beamed from the future as part of an alien hybridization project. Those people didn't change my mind. And I've had other people on the show who are white supremacists, who are men's rights activists, who are using their own versions of reason and their own sort of identity positions to argue something that I think, again, goes against the evidence. And they didn't change their mind either. But I think where my mind has changed over time is the time I've spent talking to people who believe things that I disagree with has taught me how to empathize, how to see those people as human beings, how to have conversations with people I disagree with in a way that isn't antagonistic, aggressive, and therefore unproductive. So I think every single time I've spoken to someone that holds these views that I would disagree with, I think I've learned something. It just hasn't been a life-altering, complete 180 on a particular topic. It's been, subtle nudges about how we interact with people respectfully that we disagree with.
Right. It sounds like an understanding maybe why people believe in what they do, which is, going to be really, really helpful.
Understanding the factors that contribute to people's beliefs, and that it's not just about having the wrong facts, for want of a better way of expressing it, but it's all these other social factors. And if we do want to help people, I think it's incumbent on us to try and help people, especially when we're talking about ideas that can be really damaging. The way to do that is to first understand how people get there, and then to try and as gently and diligently and respectfully as possible unpick some of those things and provide a safety net to replace the kind of support people get, so that they don't remove one part of what they can see as a community and then find themselves adrift. So how we can keep them connected I think that's what I've learned along the way, but it hasn't been a single thing, I'm afraid.
Fair enough. I wasn't really expecting like, oh, but by the way, I do believe in,
Yeah.
So Marsh, thank you so much. You've given me so much to think about. And again, I have to add another nice skeptics to my list. So
there's lots of us out there. Sometimes we're not as loud or as noticeable as the people who go viral for saying something a bit nasty, but there's lots of us out there. Compassionate skepticism is the way forward.
Yeah, for sure. So where can people find you online to connect with you and learn more about what you do?
So to follow all of me, I'm Mr. M Marsh on Twitter. My podcast is Be Reasonable, although I haven't put an episode out for about 6 months. It's really bad. And I work for a charity called the Good Thinking Society, where I try and apply these skeptical principles to ideas that are directly harming people, to try and see what we can do in terms of working with the media, with regulators, occasionally with the government, occasionally with the police, to prevent people being harmed by particularly bad ideas. So if you care about that kind of thing, check out the charity Good Thinking. It can do with all the support we can get, really.
Fantastic. I certainly will. Well, thank you, Marsh. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much. It's been lovely speaking to you, Kat.
I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. You can follow Marsh on social media at Mr. M Marsh. And if you're on the fence about this whole skepticism thing and want to find out more, I highly recommend checking out his podcast, Skeptics with a K. As I said, if I hadn't stumbled across it, I probably wouldn't be making this podcast today. If you want to keep up with The Seeker and The Skeptic, subscribe on YouTube, on your podcast app, or hey, why not both? You can follow us on Instagram or Twitter. We're at Seeker Skeptic, and we'd love a few more reviews on the Apple Store, if you happen to be in the neighborhood. Thanks for listening.